Hey, this is Gareth Webb, and you are listening to Breakout, a show aimed at cutting through the hiring noise and breaking down best practices. We'll also be tapping into the minds of other industry leaders so you can ensure your business makes the right critical hires the right way.
Good afternoon. I'm here with Stefanie from Replicated. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, very good. We have made it through March, despite the world not nearly making it through March, thanks to some stuff happening with banks, which I'm sure you know about. And then, we're nearly at the end of the quarter, and it feels like things are pretty back to normal pretty quickly, which for now anyway. But look, before we dive into what we're here to talk about, can you give me a bit of a background on Replicated, the company where you work and what you do for them, and give our listeners a bit of a background into Replicated, Steph, Sher, and your role with the business.
Yeah. My name is Steph. I am with Replicated now. We're a Series C startup in the Kubernetes and open source space. We're about 80-ish people today. We're 100% remote. So we've got folks US, UK, Israel, Canada, the Netherlands, New Zealand, kind of just pick your country at this point. And I joined in June 2021. So I have been here coming up on 2 years. I was our first TA hire, and then they had no recruiting at all when I joined. And now I've got a couple people on my team, and I own everything as far as the recruiting function is concerned. So I partner with our people team quite a bit, but we help bring them in. And then as I tell my HR counterparts, I don't have to deal with them when they there's not.
Once they sign. So you say, right, so your Kubernetes and open source, you're a tool for Replicated as a tool for developers, right, for software engineers and engineering teams.
Yeah, it's a EP tool. Our end customer is generally an engineer, almost always, when if not our end user is an engineer, and then we're using that through some sort of technical product, but we allow other companies to deliver their apps at scale. And so we end up being in the majority of Fortune 500. I think the stat is we're in the 65 of the top Fortune 100 companies, but they probably wouldn't even know because it's delivered through their customers that deliver through us.
Okay, right. Got it. And have you always been a remote business?
No, since I've been here, we've been 100% remote. When the pandemic hit, they decided to go remote. The company was a lot smaller at that point. And so they shifted, don't hold me to it, but I think in 2020. And so since I've been hiring, we've been 100% remote. We don't actually have any physical offices at all.
Okay. Which works incredibly well for your target profile candidate, right? They do not want to go into an office.
Yeah. And especially now with all these companies going back to office, it's been super really attractive for us. I think you and I have talked about, we have a pretty robust home office program that we support people through. So we bill it as up to $10,000 a year towards your home office expenses, but it breaks down into a lot of support for being remote. And we do get together as a company. The whole company just went to Cancun last month. So you get together, but I think it's super attractive for candidates and for us that we hire in the time zones that we need coverage in, but 95% of the time you're going to be home based.
Good. Very interesting. Yeah. I think we've always found you guys to be, a very thoughtful, open-minded, candidate-friendly business. People buy into your product, right? Because they've either used it or they've heard about it or it sits in the ecosystem that they sit in. Let's go back a little bit. So how did you end up, before Replicated, how did you end up in technical talent acquisition?
I always tell people it felt like Goldilocks. I was trying different size companies to figure out which one fit. I did. It's funny. I always said I never wanted to do technical recruiting because it wasn't my wheelhouse. I was more comfortable marketing and sales, and then the opportunities just kind of opened themselves up. So I was at Dish for a long time. I went over to a smaller company called Front Door, which was a spinoff of American Home Shield and some other companies, and the needs were always just focused on the technical side. So I followed where the opportunities were, and all of my management career has been in technical recruiting. So I started doing some IC work on the technical side, and then that just kind of kept opening more doors. And so it's really been more my path to Replicated was more about company size and what we were doing in this space. But I never actually intended to be in technical recruiting, just kind of fell into it. because that's where all the jobs were.
Yeah. I mean, there's like pros and cons with everything, isn't there? Like all kinds of hiring. Like now I've known you for a couple of years, and I mean this like in a good way. Like I'm pretty dry in terms of like my style, and I can't imagine you loving. And again, I don't. No offense to salespeople, but I can imagine you operating best, like bridging the gap between probably like the more technical of everything, but like sometimes talking to some commercial, sometimes talking to some go to market, but like pulling back to like the black and white of technical hiring.
Yeah, and I think our company purpose is pretty black and white. Like we know like the value that we deliver, and so that part's always been really easy for me to get behind. And then what's nice about Replicated is that everybody in our company talks to customers. So like our engineers are on the calls with customers, and so even if it's not necessarily as dry, quote unquote, as like traditional IT or engineering roles, we still have to have a customer focus in what we do. So I don't feel like I'm in this super narrow box of only hiring for whatever that traditional profile is. We get to kind of figure it out. But yeah, to your point, my style works best when I don't have to be fake about what I'm selling to somebody.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. I think that means that you're, selling more intelligently if if indeed selling right. Like a lot of the time we know like your target audience, the people you are hiring for the business that you are, know what they want for the most part, right? They're not going to have the wool pulled over their eyes, and then they know the product. And you've said this to me before, like that you're kept on your toes because they know it very, very well. They use it. You're not a user. So I think like my first question is like people that listen to us are people who are sort of listening to us about career options, and some are talent acquisition recruiters who are listening to leaders in the space. How have you pivoted as an individual and a talent leader into very technical talent acquisition role and like led with credibility and built credibility? Like, what do you put that down to?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a line of owning what you don't know. And I would say this is technical folks too. Like being full of it isn't going to get you anywhere, right? And pretending that I know like what everything means, it's just not going to build any credibility at all. And so I think I've been lucky to work with partners who put up with my incessant questions about what acronyms mean and how technologies work and things like that. And so that I can ask those questions. I don't generally ask the same question twice, but like so that I can understand from their point of view, like how these different things work, because it isn't my wheelhouse. But I think it's been a lot of like outside research, outside understanding. I've taken some courses on my own. I've like sat in interviews to hear how they ask questions. I also want to hear from my interviewers like, how they answer back to certain things, because there's a little bit of like repeating what you hear back until you say it with credibility. And so that folks can kind of hear you and say like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And you start to learn through those conversations. Like there's so much information that I know, so much that I can learn, but I can still like apply that into helping them suss out, at least the beginning stages, what a candidate is going to be a fit for. But as far as my teams, like I come to them with the idea that I'm the subject matter expert in recruiting and that I know what I'm doing as far as driving a candidate process and experience, getting them the right hire. I trust that they're going to fill in the gaps from a technical point of view. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the candidates that they get through have what they need, but that they're going to be the ones that are going to rely on their own BS detector to push the rest of that through. It wouldn't be fair for me to say like, oh yeah, like, and by the way, I have like a computer science degree and I can totally tell you if they're like technically qualified. That's a lie. So I think there's just like balancing that, but then like making sure that you do the research as a recruiter to know as much as you possibly can and come prepared to questions that you need answered.
Yeah, there's a difference, right, between like knowing what things are and then have the fluency to speak about them confidently with other people in a commercial context, and that you only really get that through doing. And yeah, I mean, I think like what I would observe is that you do know your technical, what you know what you know what you don't know. Like that's what everybody has to sort of be very clear about, as you said. And it's always pretty awful when we talk to clients and they don't, like they sort of get some stuff wrong. Sometimes it's very difficult for us as the external partner to say, oh, that's actually not correct. And so I think dealing with people who are very human about like their limitations around knowledge, and like you said, you go the extra mile to pick it up, sitting in on interviews, listening to the questions get asked, doing courses. I think those things will pile up over time to build the fluency.
I would say like making sure that your managers know how they're assessing technical level, because I'm not questioning my recruiting ability to assess like culture fit or some of the softer skills. Like I would say that a good recruiter in general is able to figure that stuff out. On the technical side though, like you need to make sure your managers have their ducks in a row so that they're all answering the same questions of like, this is what a junior person is, this is what mid-level is, this is what senior is, and this is how I'm assessing that technical proficiency. Because it's not like my job is to deliver somebody like to as much as my ability, like looks great on paper, right? Talk to the person, obviously, but like as much as you can get out of that initial conversation, they have to have a pretty standardized way to assess that technical level on their side, because otherwise, like all of my due diligence and credibility doesn't mean anything if they talk to 4 different interviewers and I get 4 different answers on the other stuff. Like then their technical credibility isn't even worth whatever effort I put in because it's not being judged on the same baseline. So I think there's a degree of being able to say like, I'm going to help you drive the best process you possibly can, which part of that is making sure that your technical stuff is squared away so that you're assessing candidates on the same metrics and that you come out of it with like the recruiter or managers are not always going to have the exact same answers, but that they're all going off of this rubric.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about before, and I wanted to talk a bit more about it especially in this market, right? Because I think things just change every month, every quarter. So Jan, Feb was looking all right. February, layoffs have been going on for a year now. And as a result, every hiring manager thinks they should have like a plethora of choice for every single position. And, we've talked about like continuous education, continuous stakeholder engagement and management. So what advice do you give your managers around that and your team internally around, leveling, around speed, around quality, around timing, not parking people and like continuing to interview and then going back to the good ones? Like they're all real bad practices. What have you put in place and replicated to try and negate that?
I mean, we try to do a couple of things, but I think it really comes down to like being transparent with your candidates as much as possible at the beginning. Like when you set up your process, having an idea of like how long you think a process is going to take. And so that if you let me, I will move somebody through at like the speed of light, right? I will move someone through in 4 days. And then you're going to have a manager at the end say, oh no, well, that's great. But like, let me see 4 other people. And then that person ends up waiting like 4 or 5 weeks while you move through the rest. And so I think being as transparent as you possibly can, trying to get as much people on the same level in the same at the same time, like when you go through those first screens so that you end up moving everybody through your panels on the back end. And then I literally just had this conversation today about pushing your managers to say like, okay, would you actually hire this person or are you just hanging on to them just in case something better doesn't come along? And like really questioning them about that. And you have to be comfortable having that conversation. But most of the times the answer is no. And I think what I said to you, like one of my managers is like, if it's not a fuck yes, it's not a yes, right? Like, and if you feel it, then it's not fair to you and it's not fair to the candidate. It's not fair to anybody to make them hang on longer because nobody wants to be second choice. Anyway.
Well, also for what you guys are hiring for, you talk about like running parallel processes, right? Which is absolutely ideal, like an equal race. Everyone starts at the same time, run the process over 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, depending on seniority, make the decision. And, very idealistic. It can happen. But for hiring, Kubernetes, DevOps tool, like engineers, cloud engineers, infrastructure engineers, really not possible, I'd say.
The market's not like, there's a ton of layoffs and it sucks. But like the market for the talent that we're looking for, it's not like all of a sudden I've now got 500 Kubernetes engineers that are ready to roll and like are ready to all interview at the same time. Like it's just not the reality. And so I think managers need to be ready to make a hire if they see a good person come through. And you as a recruiter are responsible for coming back to the team with what does the market actually look like? Because I think everyone has these anecdotal feelings. They think comps change, the market's crazy, should be all these candidates out there. And like, yeah, like there are totally more candidates available than there have been before. But it doesn't mean that what's always been a very narrow pool hasn't suddenly quadrupled.
Right. Well, I mean, have you even seen a spike in solid applicants? Yeah.
We've seen some. And I think what we've seen is more willingness to have conversations and more, like certainly some more applicants, but I don't think it's changed from like our bar is high. The technical skill set that we need is high. And it might mean we have more people in the top of the funnel. I don't think we've seen a dramatic shift in what's getting through. The reverse side is that candidates are more willing to have a conversation, but they are more scared to have a conversation too, right? Like if you have a person who wasn't part of a layoff at a company, a target company for us, they're nervous. They're like, do I go and like potentially go to a new company and get laid off, or do I stay with what I know and then ride it out and maybe get a severance here instead? And there's not like a default of trust into leaving and to go into a new company. And like all of those things factor into what we're seeing from a market perspective, but none of it means that all of a sudden all of these people are just lining up to come work at Replicated.
I probably, again, this is like what makes your life tougher, because I would have probably said a year or two ago, you guys are in a sweet spot because you're not an early stage startup and you're not a real big bloated company, but probably now you're not in a sweet spot because, you know, if we're honest, and I'm sure you may have told some of your hiring managers this, like, you know, we're not like dry powders in Series A, let's go. And we're not right about to IPO because not many people are at the moment because of the conditions. So everyone's in cost saving, capital preservation mode, and more, you know, like taking care of customers. So it's not about like pushing perks, and, you know, everyone's BS detector from a candidate perspective is very much dialed in at the moment, isn't it? Right? It's like, well, yeah, what am I doing here? You're not going to IPO in a year. So I think you probably have gone from being absolutely sweet spot to slightly less sweet spot compared to.
Like the sell at the end of like your Series C, like when I joined like I think like a week after our Series C, I was like the best. All this money, like super cool company, super cool product. Like it still is a challenge to get like big company to small company no matter what for like a skill set, but it was just like, oh hey, we're super cool, and like everybody knew we were cool. And then I think when the driving factor is probably safety more than anything else, and people just have an inherent distrust of like any company in general, like that becomes really, really nerve wracking for them. And you're doing a lot more like coaching on like, and I can't make somebody's safety decision for them because they're making decisions based on like their income and their family and all this stuff. And I can't make a decision for a person. And so all we can do is be as transparent as we possibly can. And like as a company, we're incredibly transparent with like so many things with the company, but all we can do is be transparent and say, hey, it's your decision. You need to make the decision that's best for you. This is why we're all here and we think we're the best. But I think sometimes recruiters end up trying to make decisions for candidates and they feel like giving them, I'm going to make this easy for you. You end up kind of baiting and switching people a little bit because you're trying to assuage their concerns that they may or may not already have.
And yeah, without any visibility, like, you know, I'm sure plenty of people were telling everyone at Meta they were fine after 10,000 layoffs. And then like a month or two later, there was another 10,000. I would love to get some practical kind of hacks that you've formulated in your time at Replicated. What sort of advice do you give to people out there who deal with very technical management and teams daily in a remote setting to try and influence them? Like, how do you influence them? It's like, you know, hiring better than them. They know coding better than you. So how do you influence them? What are the things that you do practically to nudge them into your kind of sphere of influence? Like, what has worked?
I mean, as much as possible, we try to stick, like when I first started, we had no process, right? So like involving them in those process decisions, I think at the beginning helps them feel like they have into what the process looks like. Cause I lean on them and say, you know, how we do technical or whatever. But you'll hear like all recruiters say is like, it's going to come down to data, as much data as you possibly can to say, this is what the market looks like. This is what we use a tool called Seekout, which has been phenomenal for us from a sourcing perspective, but really trying to say like, when you narrow down by the factors of what we are looking for, your market looks like this many people. I think you were with us on a search where we were talking to one of my managers and we were like, if you're looking for this specific skill set, there's 30 people that's this role, right? And being really honest about, we can absolutely try, but like, this is the timeline that you're looking at, and trying to figure out what's the cost benefit analysis. It's not super easy to quantify recruiting other than to say, hey, here's your agency spend. It's not as easy to say like, this is the cost of the 6 months it's going to take you to make this hire, but helping managers and leadership put into a frame of, this is how much it's going to cost you to wait to hire this person if you wait the 6 months to a year, versus this is what the market looks like right now. And if you make a decision on it today, you might be like spending money in terms of ramp up time, but you're going to save that money in terms of how long you're going to be waiting for the perfect person.
Like cost of MTC that you mean? Yeah. That is really hard to quantify. it's apparently just far more expensive than anybody thinks it is. But like,
It's super expensive. And like, sometimes it only works when you're like at the end of 6 months. You're like, oh man, if we only hired that person we talked to, like, we'd be in a lot better shape. And I think that sucks to have those conversations, but being able to like use the tools and the data that you actually have, as opposed to letting them rely on their own anecdotal bias, because they'll say a lot of like, well, I heard this or I saw this. And you're like, you need to put some number behind it, like as much as you possibly can, to say, this is how long it's going to take you. This is what the market really looks like. Or, one example, we have a manager that's like running a process that takes a month. He's lost like 4 or 5 candidates because this process takes so long to be able to come back and say like, look, process is not working. You're losing candidates because of a problem we created by ourselves.
his process is a month.
Yeah, this is a bit of an older situation, but like he had a process that took a month on purpose. Like there was a presentation that was part of it. Other things that were part of it. It wasn't just like a month long worth of conversations. But you lose people, especially in this project, because if they're laid off, they're looking for other job. And they're not going to do the common courtesy of being like, hey, like I got this other offer, but I'm really interested. Like, can you speed up your month long process into the next week? Which we can't do because that's not fair to candidates, and you can't do to them because you're not putting them through like the same process as everybody else. But they're not gonna. They're like, I don't have a job, so I need to take the job that's in me. But sometimes aren't going to understand that until they've lost a couple candidates, which sucks. And sometimes they're just going to stick to it and they're going to say, I'm okay with that. And then you as a recruiter have to just be like, that sucks, but it is what it is. It's what it is, because you're not going to win every battle.
No, I think that's the thing I talk to our team about, is like, you just can't win every battle. We try to help kind of establish what you just talked about, right? So I think to sum up what you just said there is, if you're dealing with technical or hiring managers with high bar, but you want to try and sort of bring them in and influence them, you're saying bring them in really early on process, help them design process, but use your data. In your case, you use SeekOut, which I definitely know and been tracking. Because you can get really granular, can't you, in that?
Yeah, I'm a SeekOut fangirl for sure. I think they just like super, super granular. You can get a lot of diversity information. You also just learn like you can source by like folks' other profiles that exist off of LinkedIn, which I think is interesting because a lot of folks live of LinkedIn. But you can get a ton of data. And I think the other thing to ask your managers is, what does this person like absolutely have to come in with today versus what they can learn when you're talking about the beginning of the process? Because a lot of times it's not as robust as they think it is. The challenge we run into all the time is like, how much directly applicable Kubernetes experience do they have to have versus like side projects or whatever. And a lot of times they haven't had the side project expertise that lends itself to like the professional side. But being able to ask your managers like pretty upfront, why couldn't they learn this? Like, why are you expecting that it would take like this long to ramp up? Because you're going to miss out on a lot of other types of experiences if you're only honed in on like these 1 or 2 skills, because those skills are what end up making you so narrow.
Yeah. Well, you could just put some of the money towards like, I don't know exactly the one, but like I would say like, one that comes to mind just because they're here in Austin is like a cloud guru. I think they got sold. But like, you'd think hire somebody smart and good, put them on an intensive month-long Kubernetes or 2 weeks. They probably get the gist of it. Once they start talking to customers and deploying, they may get there. But I think a lot of people just don't like that from a career risk perspective, right? They just think, oh yeah, what if they come in and they don't get it? Then it's on me.
Yeah. I think, like the space you're in, right? If you're talking about cost savings, you're talking about like, hey, we don't have money to bring people up to speed. You're looking for unicorns. And then you're like, well, why is it taking so long? You're like, because you're still looking for unicorns. Like, even though you think the market shifted that much, like you're still looking for something that's very difficult to find.
Yeah, it was difficult anyway, and it's still difficult, and it might be more difficult. Yeah, because the reality is not every company is doing terribly. Even the ones that did make layoffs, like, it's a bit shady about like, Google and some of those, like they're still making billions in profit. So those key specialists that keep their infrastructure running are getting paid bank still. So I think like you've sort of mentioned the scarcity of what you're looking for. Are there any other like big pain in the ass things that you're dealing with right now that you're handling? Like other than you maybe not as like, fresh Series C like that, that's a couple of years on, like, are there any real like, pain in the backside things that you're finding coming up into very 2023 problems.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just like what we talked about, right? Like expectations of managers versus expectations of candidates. And you're just dealing with candidates needing jobs and being terrified of jobs at the same time, and managers totally forgetting what it was like to interview, to be in a market like this. And I work for a place that has a lot more empathy than most, but I think just they haven't interviewed in a while and they don't have an appreciation for what some of these folks might be going through. And so I think that timing of understanding what it looks like when you're asking time from a candidate, this is not by any means a 2023 problem, but everything feels like it's just super amplified. Like we're running into, hey, we're not this super well-known like name brand company. If you know us, you know us. And you like, if you're aware of Replicated, you're usually like pro Replicated, but that's still within like a very like incestual pool of candidates. And then you have just a lot of feelings. Like, is it okay to complain that my biggest problem is that everyone's got a lot of feeling on both sides that don't seem to line up? Like terrified candidates who are rightfully so, like really burnt out and really scared and asking really hard questions. And then managers who don't necessarily have the same empathy because they're not in the same situation. Not for like lack of trying, but they're just, I think it's one of those situations that you can't appreciate until you're really in. And those don't line up when you're then trying to recruit for a role that doesn't have a lot of allowance for flexibility. Because you're trying to manager. It's like the best way to be manager be like, oh, well, what's, how do you expand top of your pipeline or whatever? And the answer is always flexibility. But then they're like, well, we can't be flexible. You're like, well, then why can't we expand the pipeline more? And you're like, again, like the same thing we're talking about is like, it is just not a crazy wide pool of candidates. And the skill set we look for, I think one other thing we didn't hit on was that we've seen a lot of folks at bigger companies, like big companies, great skill set, not always the right culture fit for us, and certainly not always the right comp fit. And so you've got a lot of like pie in the sky candidates who are like, they would be awesome. We're like, yeah, but like we make more than our leadership team does.
Yeah. There's seven figure guys like at Microsoft, right? And GCP and like the big, Red Hat, like they're leading hands-on like IC engineers are all incredibly expensive.
We talked to Twitter people like after the fiasco that is Twitter, and like no offense to them, but like their comp expectations are just crazy, like so high, and like that's what they were making, so that's totally fair. And we're like, awesome, you would get to do truly valuable work, but I think you would feel like you were poor, like which is not fair. Like it's just totally different ballgames when you're talking about like startup to any of those kind of companies, and that's been tough too. We're looking at some phenomenal skill sets that may or may not make sense culturally, but like we can't blow the bank on one person either.
Say this is not like we haven't talked about this before, but like say all of a sudden things started like really going nuts for Replicated and you just had to hire more engineers. It would probably become self-evident that they can't all be Kubernetes experts, but like what would you do? Like say you had to hire 100 engineers in Q2.
Yeah, we're manifesting our future goals. I think we've played a lot around with, and we've done it for different groups of like I talked about, kind of a Kubernetes onboarding. And so I think what it will allow us to do is because for folks that don't have the Kubernetes skill set, the ability to learn it at Replicated has been super appealing, because it's not always something you get to have hands-on experience with, especially like in a front end role, for instance. So I think if we had to do it, we probably would open our parameters quite a bit, figure out like what our ability to ramp up and support with like different levels of engineers, because we've tended to hire like more senior too. And then just figure out like what skill sets that we can help bring in, like that would that allow for that flexibility. I think now if I got to be like, hey, you can hire for 100 engineers and they don't all have to be Kubernetes focused, then the market becomes way more appealing, because then you're like, wow, there's a ton of different skill sets, there's a ton of different experiences out there. A lot of people will work to some really cool in different spaces that just because they don't fit into, like I have one headcount, right? Like they don't fit into that one role, you would get tremendous assets that came out from like.
Yeah, I mean, it would be an interesting social experiment, wouldn't it? To be like, what would Replicated look like today if it had hired engineers and onboarded with Kubernetes versus just hired with Kubernetes, or like more of a mix, like 50-50 or something. Do you feel like diversity in hiring has dropped off a little bit because the economy's tanked?
Or I don't know if there's like a yes or no answer to that. I think I've seen diversity, like folks that focus on diversity work. I read an article the other day have been dramatically impacted by layoffs, which sucked. Like when you think about like outside of the engineering space, like a lot of companies who were like, oh yeah, we're so committed to diversity and this, all of a sudden like laid off their whole D&I departments, which
Yeah, I've seen that.
is super shitty. I don't think for us, I think it becomes even more difficult though when you think about the position that we're in. We have like 4 headcount right now, and each one is specific. You have to focus, and you have the privilege of, but also the challenge of being able to find like the perfect fit for every role. And sometimes when you're hiring for diversity, you're trying to expand that pool as much as possible and make sure that you're being as inclusive as you can. And when you're narrowing that down, that pool automatically becomes smaller and smaller. And so I think like if I had to pick an answer to that, yeah, sucks. Like it just sucks. But I think the reality is the narrower you get, the less room you leave for diversity, period. And all companies that are hiring with a narrow focus right now, unless they're being super intentional. Somebody at my work the other day was like, unless you're being intentionally inclusive, you're being exclusive. Like unless you're being intentionally inclusive about your pipeline and other things, then it's probably not gonna work.
Yeah, I would say a year ago, it was in every single conversation we had, every client onboarding, every position kickoff, every pipeline, every set of matches we were walking through. I'd say it's 50-50 now, but we've got a lot less. I mean, we've got a healthy amount of companies hiring, but then a year ago it was just ridiculous. And now I think it's 50-50, but the ones that are still very much front of mind are like, they are hiring more intentionally, full stop. Like they're not rushing hires through. They're defining positions more thoughtfully. I think all that stuff's a good thing. But yeah, when we've seen the D&I sort of specialists get cut, and it's brutal.
And like you said at the beginning where you talk about like cost benefit. Like, so for us, like diversity is still at the forefront of like every conversation that we have about hiring. But you have to be willing to say this is going to take you longer to make the hire. You're not, and you're like, I need this hire in a week. Like the first available candidates are generally a diverse slate. And so if they're like, yeah, we're super narrow, we're like, need this perfect unicorn of like all these super technical skills, I need this person in 30 days, like we're going to do everything we can to try to incorporate diversity into that conversation. But you have to be super intentional about saying like, it might take you a little bit longer to make sure that you're like touching everything that you possibly can to incorporate that into your pipeline, but it's not going to happen in 30 days. So like, if you think it is, like, you find them for me.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think we have noticed that this year, like things that would have turned around very quickly, like a week or two to get like 5 matches made to a client position. It's maybe a little longer now, especially given the whole SVB thing. Like, you know, people want to take their time before putting their name to something.
We got to make sure that they were all.
Yeah, exactly. So I was going to ask you that, like, are you getting asked by any candidates, or like, do you offer up the cap table?
We haven't been asked yet, thankfully. I don't think it's come up. I think we would be transparent about it with them, and team are like super cred communicating with us of the companies, but I don't think it's come up with candidates too much yet. But like, has been conversations where like candidates are just asking difficult questions, period. And like, if your team's prepared to answer them, because I'm sure they ask you before they come to us. They're like, what about this layoff they had in June? Or what about the banking stuff? Or like, is that Series C money about to run out? Like, they're going to ask questions, and they're going to ask them with people who are not ready to answer those questions, at least with not like company line. So I think you need to make sure that your teams are ready to answer difficult questions now, because consistently, I think the biggest thing we see is just candidate skepticism. Like, not just of us, but like of anywhere. I see a ton of people who are like, how shady is it to go to a Google or a Facebook while they're recruiting, while they're laying people off? Like so shady. But some people don't have a choice, right? Like, you have to get a job, whatever it is. But I think they're just super, super skeptical in a way that they haven't been in like a really long time. Like 2 years ago, it was the lottery for everybody. Like, I feel like everybody's just rolling and just.
No, it was 2 years ago. It was a berserk. We were getting screamed at by people like where is everybody? And it was kind of hard, actually. I prefer it now for us because it's a bit more like I said, measured. Yeah, I think. What's your view on the layoffs? Like, do you think that what I think is shady, and I get why people do it, and I think there's lots of fear in Q4, and it's continued. But there's a lot of it'll be interesting to see the quarterly numbers of some of these businesses, right? And whenever they report, like April, May, so Salesforce, Meta, Google. I can't imagine Google posting anything other than billions of dollars in profit, but they made a lot of people redundant. But I think there is the whole US model, right, is hired at will. So you can leave when you want, you get fired, and that you live and die by the sword. And that is kind of honestly pretty rough as a European coming over here and seeing it in action. But like, what's your, like, do you guys look at laid off candidates? You would review them?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of companies thought that like headcount growth was growth, right? They were like, we're going to hire and then we're going to show that it's growth. And like, we could have a whole other conversation on the degree of bullshit that I think that some of these layoffs are. Because I think like something took what was that like terrible one, like better.com or whatever it was, where they like laid people off. That's like really, really badly. I forget what the website was, and then a bunch of other layoffs happened. And I thought the thought was like, well, we can't be as bad as them. So like, we might as well do ours now because it's just not any headwaves. And that they hired without like any any forethought of like what the rest of the world was going to look like. Yeah, I think we do look at laid off candidates. And I think if you're not now, you're being dumb. Like, it's not fair to hold a layoff or multiple layoffs in the last 3+ years against anyone, because it's certainly not their fault. And like that mentality of, well, they got laid off, so they must not have been as good, isn't really fair when you look at some of the caliber of folks that have been laid off recently and the types of companies that they're coming from. I'm like, that's a company problem. That's not the individual personal problem. There used to be a mentality that like, oh, they just got like rid of the lowest common denominator. And I think maybe that's still biased, but like maybe 3 years ago that was more relevant. Now, if you're doing that, you're like really missing out on people and holding something against them that's just not their fault.
Yeah, I mean, you've just got like the whole motivation thing as well, right? Like everyone wants to handpick the person who's really loving life and put them into their business. But like in terms of output and drive, like people who through no fault of their own have been laid off, like they're going to want to try very hard to make sure that doesn't happen to them again. I would argue they could probably come in and either they're going to get so disenfranchised with corporate world, they're never going to go into it again and freelance and set their own thing up, or they're going to go into it and be like, I'm going to make sure that happens to me again and like pick the right company, pick the right seat. Not that means it will never happen again, but no, I think you're absolutely right. People should look at it. We've seen an attitude shift this year in the last 3-6 months. Like people didn't want to look at laid off candidates before, and now they're like, oh, these profiles are really good, and we're like, yes, like it's not their fault.
Nothing's safe anymore, right? Like I think before it used to be like, oh, ex Google, ex whatever, it was like this safe thing. And so if you got laid off in one of those companies, like you were lying about the fact that you like cursed your boss out or something crazy, but like nowhere's safe. Like you could have gotten laid off from a startup because they got shut down or this, but like now, just like everywhere you look is a layoff. So you can't be like, well, it's that type of company or that type of profile, because it also used to be like recruiters still get disproportionately laid off. But if you look at like Twilio's layoffs, they laid off like their entire security team, or like they laid off like the big engineering teams, where I have not seen engineering layoffs like this, like almost ever. Like the kind of engineering folks that are getting laid off is insane.
I don't think it's happened since when was the .com? I wasn't working then, so I'm not that old.
Thankfully, I really call my dad about that one, but yeah, it's like that. It used to be like, well, if you were in engineering, you were safe. Like it was cool, wouldn't get laid off, and so there was a disproportionate look of, well, if you got laid off in engineering, you must have done something wrong, and like that's just what it is anymore. I don't know if it's ever really true, but now it's definitely true. There's just like entire teams of like really qualified engineers where like the recruiting part of me that's like, wow, the market's crazy. I'm like, holy shit, you guys are like, you're available, because I'd never been available before.
No, it's like Uber like shut down their freight business that they tried. I think they acquired somebody and turned it into the Uber Freight, and they've just shut the whole thing down. And there's amazing people in the team. For you, like it's hard to say, isn't it, in this year, but like, where do you see like talent going for startups and scale ups? And for you personally, like in terms of like career aspirations, do you see people in TA sort of bleeding even more? And is that a good thing, or do you see it as staying? Like, what's your thoughts on how it should be shaped in the industry, and what do you want to do like longer term? Like, how do you sort of set your goals?
Such a big question now, but I mean, I think I'm really lucky to work at a company that sees the value in keeping recruiting on, even if we're not hiring at the same pace. And I think that's like, I feel really fortunate to be in that position. I think a lot of what the market has been is like a lot of companies like that were super short-sighted. They were like, we're going to hire a ton of people. They hired a ton of recruiters. And then they were like, just kidding. Like, we don't need people. So like, that sucks. I also think a ton of people got into recruiting because at the time they were like 2 years ago, I was seeing recruiting salaries that I've never seen in my entire life. Like, I was like, y'all are making as much as the engineers were hiring. It was insane. And I think people got into recruiting being like easy money and not understanding the kind of grind that comes with it. I don't think we're going to see a crazy shift in that this year. I think we're still going to be like slow but steady and still see things pick up. Honestly, I think we'll see more, especially like earlier stage companies kind of go like the RPO model or bring in like agency support or have like almost like fractional recruiting come in to help them build it out. And then if they're smart, take a breather, say, hey, headcount doesn't always mean growth. What do I need? And then kind of when they're ready to build that function out. But when they're hiring just like 1 to 2, whatever, you don't really need like a full TA function. You need support and you need an idea of what your looks like. But you could do that with like your group, right? Like you don't need like a full me to come in and build it.
You don't need 5 of you, like some startups had.
Yeah, just full departments for 10 hires a year.
Oh yeah, you wouldn't believe you mentioned the salaries. Like I interviewed some folks for us last year just as the layoffs were happening, and I interviewed one lady who she'd had 6 years of experience post college, but only 2 really in kind of people ops TA, and only really 1 year of full TA. And she was on like 140 grand at Google doing tech sourcing. She got laid off, and I was like, "You're not going to get that salary again. I'm very sorry."
When I started recruiting, I made 30 grand a year, and I didn't even ask questions. I was like, "Oh, cool job." Like, yeah, I get salaries, but like, also, I tell people this all the time. I was like never richer than when I made like 45 grand a year and lived in like a shared room. I felt like I was rolling in money then, and now being an adult is all this. But yeah, I think it'll shift. I don't think companies will hire recruiters the same way that they're hiring now. I don't think recruiters are going to get the same money that they thought they were getting the last 2 years either. And that if you're going to get into recruiting, you better really like it. And you better be able to find out what you can do that's transferable to other teams. Like I know I never want to be in HR. It's aside for me, but there's other things that I can do and still add value to the company that aren't necessarily in like putting a butt in a seat, because there's not going to be that many seats to fill. So you still have to be able to show value and find companies that want to see your value in that, so that they're just hiring you for like that one thing and then they don't need that thing anymore. It still is dumb to let all those recruiters go, because when it inevitably does swing the other way and then they're like, oh crap, now we don't have anybody, like that's not the greatest way to look at it either. But I do think it'll shift more towards like RPO models kind of thing.
Yeah, more flexible, like overhead. Yeah, everything just got too silly, didn't it? And it might have been fun for a while for a lot of folks, but I think in reality, like there needs to be a bit more sensibility. Cool. A couple of things before we wrap up. On that note, I think a good question to talk about is like, what do you think talent acquisition industry is missing?
I'm really interested to see what some of this AI stuff does with recruiting. I think it's filling in a lot of gaps we do a lot of things that are manual, or like we make it too hard on purpose. Like, so I will say I hate LinkedIn like AI feature that they gave for InMail where it sends the same message to everybody. I'm like, I know you all did great.
No, thank you. Not for now. Yeah.
I'm going to put an AI response to your AI message back to me. But I think there's some like big gaps that are just going to get filled in by like AI, like that'll help you just do your job better. Cause like the fun part, at least of recruiting for me, is like helping somebody get a new job, figuring out what works best for them, and then putting them in the right role. And a lot of the sourcing and the, like not all sourcing can be automated, but like the messaging and how you find some of those people and like the process. There's some really cool like candidate experience tools that are coming out now that just allow you to do the human to human part and then figure out like hopefully that part doesn't get replaced by the robots or whatever, but like you get to do the part that's enjoyable and the part that makes a difference and fill in the gaps with like HR tech that makes sense, as opposed there was just kind of this wild wave of a bunch of stuff that nobody really needed. I think there's some stuff that's really coming where, wow, it's like super cool. It's gonna make my life a lot easier.
Yeah, we're, funnily enough, Jake and I just talking about our pitch deck that we're talking to investors about, and our roadmap is, very much like, okay, the sourcing piece is laborious and like scrolling through, right? It's like people just don't do it properly because it's long-winded. So we're working on like the whole sourcing sort of part of the messaging is like, if you could source while you slept, like set a position up, you go to bed, and in the morning there's your top 20 folks, and they're all primed and interested. That's kind of like holy grail. So that's kind of one of the things we're trying to work on. I think what you said is key, right? Like the industry went from so human centric and salesy, where people didn't trust humans. Then it's going to be full like botty spam mode for sourcing, where people just want to talk to a human. Like, and that maybe we might get there, right? So it's like, yeah, great for sourcing and engagement and messaging and scheduling, let the bots do their thing. But when someone wants to go, if someone's like, oh, can I just ask about the 401k, or can I just ask about who's the VP coming in? Do you know them? Are they decent? What's their background? Like the craving, like we see it, like people like love signing up to a platform. They love building out their profile because they feel like they're having influence. But sometimes it's like, hey, I just want to talk to someone. And so I think we might be getting to the point where there's this nice blend, and it's the humans involved at the right time, whether it's prep or debrief or, like you said, helping negotiate. That has to be humans for as long as it should be. And then you mentioned Seek Out. Anything else in terms of your like HR talent stack that you love or wish you had?
I really love Guide. I think we've talked about Guide before. It doesn't necessarily work for the number of hires that we're making, but it's a really cool candidate experience tool. Talk about messaging. They just launched, like, their whole thing is creating like an automated but human centric candidate experience all in one place. And they just launched like a messaging tool so you can interact with candidates there. And like, it used to be like when I first started recruiting, I had to call everybody like all the time. I had to call them after hours because they were all at work. It's like now I feel like so old saying that, but like now they can like text you or they can like interact with you on this platform and like have the ease of something really seamless from an interaction standpoint, but they still get a human at the other end, which is just super cool and just makes it like super clean. But I would say like Guide, Seek Out. We've looked at Ashby from an ATS standpoint where we've talked to them a couple of times. They're doing some really cool stuff on the reporting, like table stakes as far as ATSs are concerned. But if I had to pick one, like my deserted island, like recruiting tool would probably still be Seek Out. They're just such a good sourcing tool and has done really just given us a ton of information we didn't.
Yeah, that's good to know. Anybody, before we wrap up, anybody you think like, everyone always brings up somebody, like anybody that we should think about trying to talk to on this podcast, anybody that you like respect in the people or the talent industry or technology, don't have to be people in talent, like we're talking to C-suite founders.
I got a friend, this guy, Fop, I'll tell him afterwards that I talked about him, but he's just like the smartest guy I've ever met, but he went to DoorDash and he just left to go join another coworker of mine at a company called Multiverse. And he's
I know them. Yeah, the UK firm.
Yeah. And they're opening their US branch. And so they're slowly collecting all of my ex-coworkers. But he just joined to be their head of talent ops. His name's Spock Lamb is his last name, Lam. And he's just, you would love him. He's like literally the smartest guy I've ever met. He used to like, we would sit in the office and he would tell me what to buy for Bitcoin. And if I had listened to him, wouldn't be working here. I mean, $1 million instead. But yeah, he's somebody who like has a like almost like a data centered approach to recruiting and like all of the things that he does, and just looks at it the most metrics based that I've ever seen somebody do. Where I exist on soft skills. Pop would be the one to like, he lives and breathes the number side of it.
Perfect. Cool. Well, yeah, I know. I used to work when I worked for Hired. I worked with somebody who's now one of the sales directors in the UK. And I know they've absolutely destroyed it in the last 5 years.
Run ton.
Tony Blair, who's incredibly rich, his son is now incredibly rich as well. So well done to the Blair dynasty. Cool. We'll see if we can give him a little knock. But look, Steph, thank you so much. Appreciate all your words and wisdom on technical hiring. Be sure to catch up soon. Thank you very much.
Cool. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Breakout. If you want to hear more, make sure to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast to be the first to get notified when future episodes are released. If you like the show or want to share feedback, please leave a review so we can keep improving and share the word with other leaders in the tech talent space. If you have suggestions for topics we should cover, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Gareth.